Is it possible to be addicted to food or to sugar or to something else delicious that maybe is being consumed in larger quantities than you were hoping for? Well, that is the nature of what I want to talk about on this Facebook Live video. Lots in store. This is a juicy subject, and certainly the topic of so-called food addiction is one that we frequently get asked in our office here at Health Stand Nutrition. So I'm Andrea Hallwegner, registered dietitian and CEO of Health Stand Nutrition, and one of our areas of specialty here is really navigating the more challenging I would say eating issues in general, those being, of course, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and all sorts of emotional-based eating as people try to journey towards their personal best weight. And so I wanted to cover this subject because I think there's some really important differences between talking about food and talking about things like drugs and alcohol and that whole addictions-based model. So I'm going to do my best to navigate some of this discussion here, and I am looking forward to your comments, your questions, your experiences in the comments. If you're watching this live or if you're watching this later, I'd love to hear from you in terms of what your experience has been. So here's a couple of questions that we often get in our office. One is, I can't manage sweets. Should I avoid them totally and completely and treat them like alcohol or drugs? And so that is one thing I want to navigate in this session today. Second most common question that we get in the realm of this topic area is, should I avoid certain foods like carbs that trigger binge eating? Also a really common question here. They're delicious foods and sometimes very hard to manage. So the short answer to those questions of can you be addicted to food and should you avoid something delicious like sugar or starchy sweets and savory things that might be challenging you right now, the short answer to that question is no. And I want to dig into why, because there's some important differences as we really look at the best approaches to really navigate just that overall food relationship and binging and binge eating disorder. So let's dive in here. First of all, when we think about, what the term food addiction could potentially actually mean, there's not actually a true scientific meaning or not something that you're going to find in psychological literature from an actual diagnosis perspective. But what I can tell you, the term food addiction is often sort of more casually used, and really the evidence from a science perspective does not say or not suggest that you can be addicted to food. So this may or may not be a good good news for you if you've been curious about this subject. We can't place food in the same category as drugs and alcohol, simply on the most basic sort of level, because food is something necessary for overall life. Whereas, of course, with drugs and alcohol, we can abstain completely from them and still live a healthful life. So that's one of the major core differences here. And now I want to get into, what researchers are thinking and exploring is perhaps a better term than talking about food addiction might be to really think about things as more of a addictive-like eating behavior. And so that is very, very different when we look at, it's more of the behavior of what's happening around food. And a lot of that has to do with psychology. So we're going to dig into more of that, so stay with me. So what is the difference between binge eating and substance abuse when we're talking about food versus drugs and alcohol? Because there's some important similarities, which is I think where the whole food addiction kind of use of that term is coming from, but there's also some really big differences. So I want to explore that. So first of all, when we look at the similarities between binge eating and drug and alcohol abuse, of course, we've got sort of more cravings to engage in that particular behavior. We've got a feeling of loss of control, relentless thoughts about that behavior. I know our clients that struggle with binging often are obsessively thinking about food. They're planning binges in their mind, really just struggling with so much noise when it comes to their thought pattern around food. And it's certainly the same when we think about drug and alcohol abuse, that relentlessness. Often there's also an element of denial, or there's an element of secrecy often. Most of our clients that we're working with here in collaboration with psychologists are not typically struggling with over-consuming and binging in super public forums. Oftentimes, lots is done alone and much more in secrecy. So again, a lot of what we see in drug and alcohol abuse is certainly, it can look like so many things, but certainly there's an element of denial or secrecy that can be involved there. And we also know that there's repeated unsuccessful attempts to stop that behavior. So those are the similarities that we see. But here's some of the differences. The key challenge when we think about food versus drugs and alcohol is actually the amount of food consumed. It's actually not what foods are eaten, because if food was truly addictive, and eating disorders such as bulimia or binge eating disorder were a true addiction, then people would only consume so-called addictive foods. And we certainly know that isn't true. We have clients struggling with binging here that will binge on a wide variety of food. It's not a single sort of category and not a single type of food that typically is consumed. So one of the big differences is that. And the second thing is there's no desire to avoid binging. There's not a drive to continue it for a lot of our clients struggling with binge eating disorder here. What we do know though, of course, with alcohol and drugs is there's a very strong desire or an intent to continue that against the background of which their excessive use is actually taking place. So really big differences in intent. So can an addictions model, or more of a traditional 12-step model, be helpful for people with binge eating disorder? There's certainly organizations that support that more addictions-based treatment for food. Again, when we look at the research here, again, different things are going to work for different people, but the overwhelming amount of science and psychological advice to really help move people forward around binging struggles and eating disorders are definitely not using a 12-step model. They're using much more conventional psychological approaches such as cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, DBT-based therapy, mindfulness as a strategy, EMDR. So these are some more of the psychological ways the psychologists we're collaborating with tend to approach people that are struggling with food. So CBT, which is probably the most well-studied, most well-researched type of approach to approaching binge eating disorder, really is very, very different than an addictions-based model in a couple of key ways. So a 12-step program is going to be really coming from the premise that you have no ability to recover, and that the disorder with drug and alcohol abuse has no cure. And of course with CBT therapy, and of course what we live and see in the clients that we work with here, is that recovery is entirely possible for our clients that are struggling with binging issues and disorder-based eating. So that is good news, is that recovery is absolutely possible. If you're currently struggling around your relationship with food and it feeling so overwhelming, I want to give you hope that every day we see people taking steps forward to really move them through recovery in establishing a healthier relationship with both their body, their mental health, and their relationship with food. So I'm hoping that is a helpful message for you to hear if you're watching this video and you're feeling really stuck with where to go next. The second way that more conventional CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy is actually quite different than a 12-step addictions-based model is that an addiction-based model really comes from the premise that immediate abstinence is possible and realistic. And what we know from research and also just practical experience with the dietitian team here is that stopping binging from a food perspective is going to take some time. I don't think I've ever met a client that just suddenly one day can completely stop that behavior, because there's so much happening that triggers that behavior in the first place. And so we're really going to look at it from both the physical reasons binging is showing up, from that nutrition reason, reason. Maybe things are being deprived, or we just have to really dig into some of the food rules and calorie rules and good food, bad food stuff that's going on, and really make sure your physical nourishment is up to par. And then, of course, the psychologist that is part of the team is going to be really digging into the emotional triggers on why binging is showing up and being used to be able to cope and gain some control in whatever's not feeling quite right in your life. And so we know binging can take some time. And so recovery from binge eating issues often takes weeks, months. You know, some of our clients here, they're with us for a long time. But what we see is over time, we can replace that sort of behavior in much more healthier coping ways. And that is very different than an addictions-based model where complete abstinence right off the get-go is sort of the core piece of the model. The other sort of core difference here is that no food needs to be avoided entirely. The research is absolutely clear here that attempting to avoid specific foods, whatever that might be, maybe you're struggling with over-consuming boxes of cereal, or we've had clients that are really struggling with if they had any kind of a baked good or sweets in their house, it's all gone in one sitting, just not being able to manage the quantity. But you don't need to avoid those foods completely, because the more you attempt to avoid those things, what the research shows and what we certainly see here with our clients is you're going to be set up with more vulnerability to actually set you up to binge further. So the act of feeling deprived or depriving yourself of enjoyable foods or just enough overall nourishment always triggers overconsumption, if not binging. And that's very, very different than an addictions-based model, which really focuses on the view that those trigger foods are toxic and they must be avoided altogether. So I'm hoping that this wasn't too overly complicated, this discussion, but I wanted to give you a clear sense that there's some huge differences between how we need to think about approaching food that's being consumed in a way that isn't really honoring your body and feeling really comfortable. I do believe you don't need to cut it out wholeheartedly like you do when we're talking about alcohol and drug abuse. So many different ways to approach it. And you just got to step into that place, first of all, of really not going at this alone. We see so many people struggle in feeling so much shame about how they're eating and how they're coping that it can be really difficult to reach out for help. And so the people that you need on your team are three people if you want to tackle really moving out of struggles through binging. And the first person you need is a family physician that has some respect for body size, eating disorder knowledge, and from our experience, this can be hit and miss in their understanding and knowledge in this area. So as long as you've got somebody workable that's willing to support you that way, I think this is good. If you've ever felt shamed by your physician, then it's time to get a new doctor. The second person you need on your team is a registered dietitian with a very clear specialization in eating disorders. And I think this is really important because so often I love my field of dietitians so much, but we all have different skills in different areas. And so one of the things you need to do if you are really struggling with binging is be really honest with the person you're seeking help with right out of the gates, right on the initial phone call as you explore maybe if this person or service is a good fit for you. Because not disclosing that doesn't put you in the hands or the care of somebody that really understands binge eating disorder. So this is an area that has taken our team a lot of years to develop skill and knowledge in, and a lot of training in collaboration with psychologists. So I think it's really key that, again, you find a registered dietitian that is very clearly working actively with eating disorders, because you're just going to feel that much more at home. Really nothing is going to surprise them in terms of the challenges and things that you're talking about, because they'll have heard it all before. If I think back to some of the clients that we see in our practice, when people use the term binging, of course, this is even such a vague term. When someone uses that term, I always dig into, what did you mean by that? Just so I can get a sense if we're talking about eating one extra granola bar than what you might have planned on, or if we're talking about some of the massive volumes of food that we see so many of our clients consuming, such as several cakes or a pot of rice or 3 boxes of cereal. almost an out-of-body, excessive, out-of-control feeling around food. And that's certainly something that we tend to see here a lot. In fact, we've had clients that have unfortunately had shoplifting charges because of their binging-based habits. So some really challenging things that we're walking through with our clients here. Not easy work on our end, as you can imagine, but some of our favorite clients to work with to really be able to just bring forward walking people through just developing a healthier relationship with food. So the third person you need on your team, I talked about the good understanding physician, a skilled dietitian in the area of eating disorders, and thirdly, you need a fantastic psychologist. This is where the heart of the work goes. And you don't need just a psychologist. Again, you need somebody skilled that has worked a ton in the area of eating disorders. So too often we found that our clients have found some benefit in the psychologist that they're working with, but perhaps the psychologist was more skilled in anxiety or depression or OCD, but maybe not highly skilled or had a ton of knowledge around just the differences in eating disorder recovery. So spending some time really interviewing the people you're seeking out some help with, I think is so key, so you can get a really good fit off the get-go. Because what we've seen is there's nothing more deflating for our clients than being able to just have to go through sharing all of the life story and the challenges around food, only to find that it wasn't a good fit from a therapy perspective. So do some research, and of course, if you're in our local area of Calgary, Alberta, happy to coordinate and share some of our favorite psychologists that we collaborate with regularly here if you need a really strong resource. So again, to sum up here, I don't think we want to be talking about food from an addiction-based model. You can't be addicted to food. We've got to learn some ways to be able to navigate healthful eating, but also soulful eating. And soulful foods are, of course, those that we choose for taste and enjoyment. And there is absolutely a way to move forward with that. So I'm Andrea Hallwagner, registered dietitian of Health Stand Nutrition. Thank you so much for watching the video today. If you found this video interesting, if you think that, hey, this would be a great topic area to share on your Facebook feed, I'd be so grateful for that. You're welcome to, of course, like my Facebook page here, as well as pop over to Health Stand Nutrition, our nutrition counseling practice Facebook page as well, because we've got different information on both of those pages. And of course, if you click on the link that I've supplied in the video feed here, what you're going to see is that I've shared with you a full sort of overview of the information I've shared today, and also shared a resource that you may find helpful to begin this journey on recovering from an unhealthy relationship with food. The free book that I'm sharing here is called Dieting Recovery: 3 Steps to Repairing Your Relationship with Food. So let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts, suggestions, information you'd like to share. I'd love to hear from you, and we'll see you next Wednesday, same time, same place, for another discussion on nutrition. A variety of topics here. Thanks so much.